We're back, and I'm always very pleased to be able to say we're joined by Elaine Donnelly, one of my favorite people. She is also one of the most important figures, I think, in her work on behalf of our military, and specifically in providing sort of an advocacy for our men and women in uniform who really can't, under the military's instructions and code of conduct, speak for themselves about what is going on, well, at the hands of the Biden administration to the military. And it's always a real pleasure to speak with her, even if the news is often not that cheerful. Elaine Donnelly, welcome back. You run a marvelous organization, the Center for Military Readiness. You have for many years. You've been serving on presidential and departmental commissions, trying to make sense of what has been kind of one big social experiment with the military, notably with respect to women in combat and homosexuals serving openly and transgenders and the like. But I had a couple of things in particular that I was anxious to consult with you about. You had a very important piece recently about Ukraine and the differences that we've been seeing there, the necessary cultural differences at work there. Talk a little bit about that and how that bears on the challenges our military are facing today.
The article started with the Quinnipiac poll. A lot of people talked about it because it said that only 53% of Americans, if they were in the same situation as Ukraine under attack, that they would stay and fight. And 38% said they would leave the country. Well, that sounded alarming, but I sensed there was more to this poll than what was being said. And sure enough, there was. When you look at the internals of the poll and the differences between men and women, you find out that 70% of men said they would stay and fight. 40% of the women. Now, that is not a slam on the women, because the women are indeed serving their country in Ukraine, but not in identically the same way that the men are. What's interesting is there's no controversy about the fact that the men are taking their wives and their children to the trains, they're sending them away to safety, and then they turn right back to defend the country. Now, this is by order of the government, okay? But there's no controversy about it. When was the last time we saw a country, a whole country, showing respect for women and children in this way? Now, I think it's worth noticing because the whole debate about draft our daughters, should we treat women exactly the same in time of war? No, we shouldn't. Because what we're seeing in the women in Ukraine, they are serving their country. They're making Molotov cocktails. They're talking to international media. And the men are going there to fight for their freedom and their country. And I just find that something that we shouldn't overlook because it's a sign of civilization that perhaps we're not going to
Yeah.
see too much longer.
It brings us to another topic that you've been focusing on for years, Elaine, and that is this effort to treat men and women more or less the same in the United States military. To Initially, we were told there were going to be different standards for performance, but they had to meet those standards, and they wouldn't be dumbed down. Talk a little about what has actually been happening in practice that seems to mean that nobody's going to be meeting the standards that we need them to meet, and our warfighting and readiness, performance is going to be affected as well.
Well, recently the Army announced that their Army Combat Fitness Test, ACFT, 3 years, actually four or more in the making, was not going to fulfill promises of gender neutrality in the standards. I've compiled all the promises that were made going back to 2013, 2015. We're going to have women in the combat arms, but don't worry, none of the standards will be changed. Women will have to meet the same standard as men. And oh, by the way, there won't be any quotas either to increase the numbers of women in the combat arms. Well, guess what? Reality intrudes. The Army has finally announced that they're going to have to follow one of two recommendations from the RAND Corporation. Now, RAND put it this way: you can have a greater number of women, but you're going to have to gender norm those standards. In other words, have women score differently, do different events, treat men and women differently. You can either do that, or you can keep the standards high and gender neutral, and you're going to lose a lot of women. Well, the Army decided diversity is more important, and they're going to take the first route. They're going to say, we'll have gender normed standards. Never mind that they have thrown overboard all the promises that were made back in 2015. And you know me, I'm not going to let them get away with this. This is all about the policymakers. It's not about women in the military or men. It certainly is not their fault. And I don't claim to speak for them either. All I'm saying is the policymakers are implementing policies that are harmful to both women and men, and they're doing it in ways that are
That's the key
weakening our
piece. And
military.
thank God you are going to be uh, taking this to the policymakers who are making these choices and doing so mostly, let's face it, out of the public eye, Elaine. So this is where your Center for Military Readiness does such invaluable work exposing the rest of us to it. When you look at how this sorts out, then there have long been different standards for men and women to the extent that women were not expected to do the same job as men. The problem arose when we were supposedly going to have them meeting the same standards that are required to perform in combat. And that was always going to be a
Right.
very, very hard thing because they're not built the same way. They're not capable of performing the same heavy lifting and all the rest of it. So, what you're saying is
Right.
that they're now going to say, well, when we promised you that we would make everybody fit to serve in combat, we actually lied and we're not going to do that. And that has to have an
Well,
impact on
it,
their ability to perform the mission. For example, being able to lift an injured comrade out of
one point.
harm's way in combat.
Right. That is one of the, there's 6 exercises in the Army combat fitness test, and that's one of them to simulate dragging a casualty to safety. Now, it's very appropriate that this new ACFT is going to be announced on, guess what? April Fool's Day. April Fools, we were kidding. What do you mean gender neutral standards? Well, you see, the Presidential Commission on which I served, we looked at this issue very carefully. And here's what we decided. In basic pre-commissioning and the entry-level jobs in the combat arms, you can have gender norm standards. You don't want to treat women and men the same because you'd lose a lot of good women in the military, and we need them. So what we said was it's okay to have gender norming in those early levels of training, provided that training was not used to justify or qualify someone for the combat arms, and that means infantry, armor, special operations forces, and the like. Now that women are eligible for the combat arms, and they decided to try this gender neutral social experiment, it's unworkable because the women's failure rates were so high. They started out, by the way, at 85% in the preliminary tests 3 years ago. Then they got them down, they tweaked it a little bit, and they said, well, we're not going to do that leg tuck thing where you have to pull yourself down or your knees up to a high bar. We'll do planks instead. Women and men can both do planks. And they made other tweaks as well. So the failure rate for the women wouldn't be as high. By the way, it's age normed also. Older soldiers were having a hard time. The problem is the failure rates are still there. And nothing less than Rand Corporation, the architect of all this, they have told the Army, look, this isn't going to work unless you do this or that. And the Army decided we'll do the gender norming. And this means actually they're doing 2 things. They are lowering the standard to a level that is equal for both men and women, but scored differently, and it's lower than it was before. For instance, if you wanted to qualify for the combat arms, you're a man, you had to do 30 of these push-ups, hand lift, special kind of push-up. Now it's down to 10, but it's equal for men and women, you see, and the scoring is still different for women and men. Now, this is going to be very interesting to see how it plays out because the fiction of equality is gone, but they'll say, well, the failing rate is still the same, 60, 100%. 160, the scoring's different, but yeah, the final result will still be the same. 60 is the minimum level, and 100 is the top level. Trouble
Elaine,
is,
we're going to have
men
to wrap
will
this
not
up,
be
but
established as much as they would be before.
yeah, what alarms me, and I know you too, and you as have you have said, studied this intensively for a long period of time and gone head to head with the Rand Corporation, which has been, pushing these, I think, misleading at best and downright deceptive propositions for years. We're going to have men who are less fit, as well as women who are simply not up to the job, and a military that is, as a result, going to be sorely pressed to be able to accomplish its missions of deterrence and winning the nation's wars if, God forbid, we have to fight them. Elaine Donnelly, one of the things that we appreciate so much of your contributions to this program is you really do help us document the kind of war on the U.S. military that's taking place at the hands of the Biden administration. And we're going to have you back soon for a further update on all of this. In the meantime, I really appreciate what you've said in terms of bringing some of that corporate memory to bear so that we actually understand this is not an anomalous situation. What we're dealing with is the cumulative effects of many, many years of misbegotten ideas and I think some dangerous ones at that. Thank you for your time. Thanks for what you do at the Center for Military Readiness. Come back to us soon with more. Next up, we'll talk with Tommy Waller about the security of our grid and more right after this.